Sophie Bell strode into the bustling lobby of the new Phoenix Trust Bank branch, her heels tapping against the polished stone floor. It was a warm afternoon and the sun slanted through the glass walls, casting golden streaks across the marble countertops. The automatic doors parted with a soft swish as she entered, adjusting the delicate silk scarf around her neck. Sophie had come for something routine, a simple transaction. She wasn't here to make a scene, nor was she here to demand special treatment. Just like any other day, she was here as a customer. The Phoenix Trust Bank was a place she had watched grow from the ground up, having invested heavily in its inception. Now, years later, it had expanded into a chain of trusted financial institutions throughout the city. Sophie had played no small part in that success, pushing the boundaries of what it meant to provide customers with fair, accessible financial services. She had personally approved this branch's location, ensuring that it met the high standards she had set for the company, right down to the final details. Sophie wasn't wearing a suit today. She had opted for something more casual, light denim jeans and a soft green cardigan that gave her an approachable air. She didn't want anyone to think she was here for anything out of the ordinary. Her purpose was simple, a withdrawal from her personal account. Walking up to the counter, Sophie found herself in front of a young teller, a woman named Emily. The teller glanced at her briefly, but Sophie had been accustomed to that sort of quick, dismissive glance. She cleared her throat softly, hoping to get Emily's attention. "Hi, I'd like to make a withdrawal," Sophie said politely, her voice steady and calm. Emily didn't look up, instead sliding a clipboard across the counter toward her. "Fill this out," Emily said flatly, still not meeting Sophie's eyes. Sophie took the clipboard and quickly filled out the simple form. Name, account number, withdrawal amount. The sum was modest, $4,500, but enough to warrant the usual security checks. She slid the clipboard back across the counter. But as Emily glanced at the form, Sophie felt a sudden shift in the air. Emily's demeanor changed slightly. Her gaze flicked from the form to Sophie's ID and then back to the computer screen. For a moment, Emily seemed uncertain, then quietly murmured, "Hold on a second," before grabbing the ID and disappearing through a frosted door into the back office. Sophie waited in silence, her fingers lightly tapping against the cool marble counter. She had expected a bit of back and forth, but this felt different. A few minutes passed, and when Emily finally returned, she wasn't alone. Brad Thomas, the branch manager, followed closely behind her. "Good afternoon, Miss Bell," Brad said stiffly, offering a weak smile. He looked her up and down briefly before turning his attention to the form. "I see you're withdrawing $4,500, he continued, his tone almost clinical. "May I see your ID again?" Sophie's patience thinned slightly. "I already gave it to Emily," she replied, keeping her voice level, though her frustration was beginning to show. Brad ignored her remark and took the ID, inspecting it closely. It was as if he was looking for something, a crack, a flaw, something that didn't fit. After what felt like a long moment, he asked, "And what exactly do you do for work, Miss Bell?" Sophie froze, caught off guard by the question. She had already identified herself as a longtime customer, and her role in founding the bank was well known within the company. What did her job have to do with a simple withdrawal? "I'm the CEO of Phoenix Trust," she replied, keeping her voice steady but with a bite of irritation creeping in. "I founded the bank." Brad glanced at the form again, then back at her. "I see," he muttered, but Sophie could see the wheels turning in his mind, as if he was deciding what to do next. "And this is a personal account, correct?" The question, though seemingly innocuous, felt pointed, like a small test that she wasn't quite prepared for. Sophie's fingers curled around the edge of the counter, and she forced a smile, now keenly aware of the subtle but palpable tension building between them. "Yes," she replied firmly. "It's a personal account. It's all right there on the form." Brad's fingers lingered over the form, tracing its edges as though something was hidden there. Sophie stood still, her mind racing. This wasn't about mistakes or security. It was about something else, something beneath the surface. "I'm going to need to ask you a few more questions," Brad said after a pause, his voice smooth but insistent. Sophie's patience was starting to wear thin. "Why? Is there a problem with my account?" she asked, her voice barely concealing her frustration. Brad didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced over at Emily, who stood stiffly behind him, her eyes darting nervously between Sophie and Brad. Brad seemed to hesitate, clearly weighing his next move. Just a precaution, he said finally, his words rehearsed. He reached for the form again, flipping it over as if he were searching for something more. Sophie clenched her fists at her sides, trying to remain calm. This wasn't just a mistake. She had been a part of Phoenix Trust from its inception. She had poured her blood, sweat, and tears into its success. And now, standing here, it felt like she was being forced to prove her worth all over again. She had been in countless meetings, shaking hands with influential figures, watching her bank grow into one of the most trusted financial institutions in the city. Yet here she was, being treated like an outsider, an imposter in the very bank she had built. "Can you tell me the amount of your last deposit, Miss Bell?" Brad asked, his voice now carefully measured, as if every word was calculated. Sophie's jaw tightened. That was the last straw. The question wasn't just unusual, it was insulting. She had been withdrawing money from this branch for years, and now, for the first time, she was being asked to prove her access to her own funds. "I don't know that off the top of my head," Sophie replied, her voice sharp now. "But you have my account number. You can pull the information up like you would for any other customer." Brad didn't respond. He simply nodded and pushed a clipboard in front of her. "Please fill this out again," he said, his tone detached. "It's just part of the process." Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she stood still, refusing to take the clipboard. This wasn't about procedure, it was about something else, something that felt much more personal. With a slow, deliberate breath, Sophie reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She began recording the scene, her eyes never leaving Brad's. "You're refusing to allow me access to my own account," she said, her voice cold but unwavering. "Despite providing government-issued identification, despite being a customer here since day one, you're making me prove my entitlement to my own money." The room seemed to hold its breath. Sophie felt every pair of eyes in the lobby on her, and she knew she had reached a breaking point. Brad had made his move, and now it was her turn to take control. "Answer me, Wall," Sophie said, turning the camera toward the security guard who had silently watched the entire exchange. "Why are you here? To intimidate me? To make sure I understand my place?" The guard shifted uncomfortably but didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Brad, who seemed unsure how to proceed now that Sophie had turned the situation around. Sophie stood tall, her resolve hardening. "I'm not leaving here until you process my withdrawal," she said quietly, but the power behind her words was unmistakable. The silence in the room deepened. Brad's face paled slightly, and he seemed to falter, unsure of his next move. Sophie had turned the tables. This wasn't just about a bank transaction anymore. It was a fight for justice. The lobby had grown quieter, and Sophie could feel the weight of every eye on her. The quiet murmur of conversations had ceased, replaced by a tense stillness that seemed to envelop the room. She stood tall, her phone still recording, capturing every moment. Brad's discomfort was palpable now. He was no longer the confident branch manager commanding the room. He was a man caught in a situation he hadn't anticipated. Sophie knew he was running out of ways to maintain control, and that realization gave her a quiet sense of power. Brad shifted uncomfortably, his hands fumbling slightly with the paperwork as if it could somehow make the situation disappear. But Sophie wasn't going to let that happen. Not here, not in her own bank. She had fought too hard to build Phoenix Trust into the institution it was today, an institution that stood for fairness, integrity, and customer service. Now, it seemed as though Brad and his team were trying to undermine those very values. "You're really doing this?" Sophie asked, her voice calm but edged with disbelief. "You think I'm just going to walk away and let you make a fool of me?" Brad didn't answer immediately. His eyes flicked nervously to the security guard, who had taken another step closer to them, as if ready to act if things escalated further. Sophie could see the uncertainty in the guard's posture, but he remained silent, unsure of how to respond to the growing tension. Sophie took a deep breath, steadying herself. She knew this moment could go in one of two directions. Either Brad would back down, or he would escalate things further. Either way, she wasn't going anywhere. She wasn't going to let this man push her around. "Brad," Sophie said slowly, each word deliberate, "you know who I am. You know I founded this bank. You know I've been a loyal customer since its inception. So tell me, why are you treating me like this? What's really going on here?" Brad's gaze dropped to the floor, and for a moment, Sophie could see a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Was he questioning his actions? Was he beginning to realize how far he had gone? Sophie hoped so, but then, like a switch flipping, he straightened up, his mask of professionalism returning. "It's not personal, Miss Bell," he said, his voice tight and rehearsed. "I'm just following procedure. We have strict policies for large withdrawals, and we need to verify everything for your security." "Security?" Sophie scoffed, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "You think this is about security? If it were, you would have asked for this information from the start. But instead, you singled me out. You've made me feel like I don't belong here, and I'm not going to let you get away with it." The words hung in the air, and Sophie knew that Brad was beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. He glanced over at the security guard again, as though silently pleading for help, but the guard remained still, not daring to intervene. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Sophie's words had cut through the tension, leaving Brad without a way out. "What's your name again?" Sophie asked, her voice cold. "I don't believe I've caught it." Brad hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the security guard before meeting Sophie's gaze. "Brad Thomas," he replied, his voice barely audible now. "Well, Brad," Sophie said, her tone sharpening, "you might want to remember that name, because it's the one that's about to be all over the news. You're not just embarrassing yourself here. You're embarrassing Phoenix Trust, and I won't let you get away with this. Not now, not ever." A flicker of fear crossed Brad's face as he realized what Sophie meant. He reached for his phone, as though to call someone for assistance, but Sophie was already a step ahead. She had been prepared for this. She had expected him to try to get backup, to call the security, or worse, to try to make her look like the troublemaker. But she had the upper hand now. Sophie was no longer just a CEO. She was the victim of a discriminatory system, and she wasn't going to let anyone forget it. "Go ahead," Sophie said, nodding toward his phone. "Call whoever you want. But know this, I'm not leaving until you process my withdrawal, and I will make sure the whole world knows how you've treated me. You can't intimidate me into silence." Brad's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time, Sophie saw a glimmer of doubt in his expression. He had underestimated her. Now he was realizing that this was about much more than a simple transaction. It was about the kind of bank Phoenix Trust wanted to be. And if he didn't want to be the one to ruin it, he needed to do the right thing. "Please, Miss Bell," he said, his voice faltering, "just give me a moment to clear this up. I'll make sure everything gets sorted." Sophie stood motionless, watching him. She wasn't going to let him get away with dismissing her concerns. She wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for every customer who had ever been made to feel less than, for every person who had been forced to prove they belonged in a place they had every right to be. "Fine," she said, her voice low and deliberate, "but I'll be watching, and I'll make sure everyone knows what happens next." Brad didn't respond. He turned, quickly walking to the back office. His shoulders hunched and his pace quickened, as if he could somehow outrun the consequences of his actions. Sophie exhaled, her eyes still fixed on the door he had disappeared through. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. As much as she had wanted to avoid conflict, as much as she had hoped that this simple withdrawal would go smoothly, Sophie knew that sometimes standing up for what was right meant making a stand even when it was uncomfortable, even when the fight seemed impossible. As she stood in the lobby, Sophie realized that this moment wasn't just about a single transaction. It was about something bigger. It was about every time someone had been dismissed, every time someone had been ignored because they didn't fit a certain mold. Sophie Bell wasn't just a customer. She was a leader, and she wasn't going to back down. Not this time. A few minutes later, Brad returned, his face flushed and his demeanor slightly more deferential than before. He walked up to the counter and, without meeting Sophie's eyes, handed her a slip of paper. "Everything's been cleared up," he said, his voice now much softer. "Your withdrawal is approved. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." Sophie took the slip, her expression unreadable. She didn't need his apology. What mattered was that he had learned a lesson today, the same lesson that Phoenix Trust needed to learn. Fairness was not optional. It was the very foundation of what made the bank great. "Good," Sophie said, her voice steady. "Now let's make sure it never happens again." As she walked out of the branch, the lobby behind her buzzed with activity once more. But for Sophie Bell, the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The doors to Phoenix Trust Bank's lobby slid shut behind Sophie, the warm afternoon air hitting her face like a welcome breeze. Her heels clicked on the pavement as she walked briskly to her car, the tension in her shoulders slowly unwinding. But beneath the calm exterior, Sophie's mind was racing. She had just gone toe-to-toe with one of her own employees, and although she had come out victorious, the battle was far from over. As she slid into her car and started the engine, Sophie's phone buzzed in the passenger seat. She glanced at it, seeing an email notification pop up. It was from her assistant, Grace. Sophie tapped the screen to open it, already suspecting what it might contain. The subject line read, "Incident Report, Phoenix Trust Branch." Sophie's stomach tightened. She had a feeling this situation with Brad and the security guard wouldn't be contained so easily. The email detailed the events of the afternoon, providing a full account of the encounter, everything from the way Brad had treated her to the uncomfortable silence that had followed. Sophie had no doubt that this email would be circulated to the higher-ups in the company. She scrolled through the email, her lips pressed tightly together. It was as she had feared. Grace had already informed the rest of the executive team. But what shocked Sophie was the attachment at the bottom. A video. Curious but wary, Sophie opened the attachment. It was footage from one of the security cameras inside the bank, the moment when Brad had tried to dismiss her, the way he had questioned her repeatedly, his tone dismissive and patronizing. There, on screen, was Sophie, standing tall and composed, demanding respect while Brad wavered, unsure of his next move. But the real shock came when the footage shifted, showing Sophie taking out her phone and recording Brad, the security guard, and the entire exchange. Her heart skipped a beat as she watched herself on the screen, her calm defiance unwavering. This wasn't just about her now, it was about making sure this wouldn't happen to anyone else. The footage had already been shared across the company, and Sophie had no doubt that it would quickly make its way to the public eye. Sophie sighed, rubbing her temples. This wasn't going to be easy, but it was necessary. She had built Phoenix Trust with the belief that fairness was the cornerstone of their success. She couldn't allow the company's reputation to be tarnished by a single branch manager who had failed to understand the importance of that principle. As she pulled into her parking spot at the headquarters, Sophie took one last look at the video. She felt a sense of resolve settle within her. This wouldn't just be a reprimand for Brad. This would be the beginning of a wider internal review, a chance to ensure that no one else ever felt like Sophie had been made to feel that day. The next morning, Sophie arrived early at the Phoenix Trust headquarters. As she stepped off the elevator and into the boardroom, she was greeted by the faces of the executive team, all of whom were already seated around the large conference table. The tension in the room was palpable, and Sophie could see the concern in their eyes as they noticed her walk in. But what was more concerning was the presence of the legal team. "Good morning, everyone," Sophie said as she took her seat at the head of the table. "I trust you've all seen the email and the video." A collective murmur rippled through the room. One of the board members, Richard, a senior vice president, cleared his throat. "Yes, Sophie, we've reviewed the situation, and I have to admit I'm shocked by the behavior of Brad Thomas. This is not how we do business here." Sophie nodded, her expression resolute. "I agree. What happened yesterday is unacceptable. But this isn't just about Brad. It's about the culture at Phoenix Trust, and we need to address it. We can't afford to have any employee, no matter their position, treating our customers with anything less than the utmost respect. We'll start with an internal investigation, of course," Richard added. "But what do you want to happen to Brad?" Sophie's eyes flicked to the legal team, who had been silent until now. They had been reviewing the legal ramifications of the video and the public exposure. Finally, one of the lawyers, Michelle, spoke up. "We need to be careful. This incident could lead to some legal complications. If Brad's behavior is considered discriminatory or a violation of Phoenix Trust's policies, we may face repercussions. But before we make any decisions about his future with the company, we need to establish a clear course of action." Sophie glanced around the table, her mind made up. "I've already made my decision," she said firmly. "Brad needs to be suspended while we conduct a full investigation. This isn't just about one mistake, it's about the systemic issues within this branch that need to be addressed." "Agreed," Michelle replied. "We'll prepare the necessary documentation for a temporary suspension, pending the outcome of the investigation." But I think we should also consider a broader diversity and inclusion initiative across all our branches. Sophie nodded. Yes, this is about more than just Brad. We need a company-wide training program that focuses on unconscious bias, inclusivity, and respect. It's not enough to say we're a fair bank. We need to show it, from the top down. The room fell silent as Sophie's words settled in. She knew that making this a priority would be a challenge, but it was the right thing to do, and she wasn't about to back down. Make it happen, Sophie said, her voice steady. We'll hold every branch accountable, and we'll set an example for the entire industry. This is the standard we expect at Phoenix Trust. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of strategy discussions, legal advice, and action plans. By the time the session ended, Sophie knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but she felt a sense of clarity that had been missing before. This was her moment to reshape the company's future, to ensure that fairness wasn't just a catchphrase but a guiding principle that would drive every decision Phoenix Trust made. As she left the boardroom, Sophie's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Grace. Press release is ready. The public knows about the incident. Are we moving forward with the diversity initiative as planned? Sophie paused in the hallway, staring at the message. It was time to take the next step. Time to turn this moment of injustice into a catalyst for real change. She typed a quick reply. Yes, let's make it official. This is just the beginning. Sophie Bell had always believed in leading by example, and now she was leading Phoenix Trust toward a new era, one where respect, fairness, and accountability were the standards, not the exceptions. It had been a week since Sophie's decisive action against Brad Thomas, and Phoenix Trust Bank was already feeling the tremors of the internal changes she had set in motion. What had initially seemed like a minor incident had quickly snowballed into a full-scale cultural reckoning, not just within the bank, but also in the broader business community. Media outlets had picked up on the story, turning Sophie's confrontation into a symbol of corporate accountability and social justice. The press release announcing the internal investigation, as well as the upcoming diversity and inclusion initiatives, had gone live that morning. Sophie had known the response would be swift, but even she hadn't expected the overwhelming support from both customers and industry leaders. Emails of support flooded the inboxes of the executive team, and social media was abuzz with praise for Sophie's leadership and commitment to fairness. Yet amid the praise, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The ripple effect of her actions, had already reached far beyond Phoenix Trust's walls, and she had a responsibility to ensure that the momentum didn't fizzle out. The true test would be in the long-term changes she could implement, both in her bank and within the industry at large. The following Monday, Sophie found herself in a meeting with the Diversity and Inclusion D&I task force she had personally appointed. The team was small but committed, an eclectic group of HR professionals, external consultants, and internal leaders who shared her vision for making Phoenix Trust a truly inclusive and equitable institution. All right, let's get down to business, Sophie said, leaning forward in her seat. We've already made an impact with the press release, but now we need to ensure these changes go deep. We're not just creating a program to check a box. This has to be a full-scale cultural overhaul. Agreed, said Maria, one of the lead consultants. But to make this sustainable, we need a clear strategy that reaches every level of the company, from the highest executives down to entry-level staff. We can't afford to leave anyone out. Sophie nodded, her mind already running through the logistics. We need training that goes beyond diversity seminars. We need real conversations about bias, power dynamics, and privilege. We need to create spaces where employees can feel safe sharing their experiences without fear of retaliation. Another team member, Paul, a senior VP in operations, spoke up. I think we also need to set clear accountability measures. If someone isn't adhering to the standards we're setting, there should be consequences. No exceptions. Absolutely, Sophie replied. We can't just say we're committed to change. We need to show it in our actions. Brad's situation is just the first step, but there are plenty of others who need to understand that this is a zero-tolerance issue. The meeting continued for hours as they fleshed out their plans. By the end of the session, Sophie felt a renewed sense of purpose. The wheels were in motion, but now it was time to turn words into action. In the weeks that followed, the changes Sophie had envisioned began to take shape. The new D&I training program was launched across all branches, with mandatory modules for all employees, starting with the senior management team. The training wasn't just about awareness, it was about action, learning how to recognize bias, how to address microaggressions, and how to build a more inclusive environment for both customers and staff. But as the new initiatives rolled out, Sophie also encountered pushback. Some employees, particularly those who had been with the company for a long time, resented the sudden shift. There were whispers in the break rooms, quiet murmurs of frustration. "Why are we being forced to attend these trainings?" one employee had said during an anonymous survey. "I've been doing my job fine for years. Why now?" Sophie knew the road to transformation wouldn't be easy, but she wasn't backing down. She had seen firsthand how the banking industry could perpetuate inequality, and she was determined to break that cycle. For every voice of dissent, there were 10 others who understood the importance of the changes she was making. It was those voices she was going to focus on, the ones who wanted to build something better, something stronger. One afternoon, as Sophie was reviewing the latest progress reports on the D&I initiatives, she received an unexpected call from the board of directors. They had scheduled a special meeting to discuss the fallout from the Brad Thomas incident. Sophie's stomach tightened as she walked into the boardroom, knowing the conversation ahead was going to be a pivotal one. The members of the board were seated around the large conference table, their expressions somber. Richard, the senior VP who had initially supported her, spoke first. "Sophie, we've been hearing a lot of feedback from some of our biggest investors," Richard began, his voice measured. "While we understand the need for the changes you've implemented, there's concern about the PR implications. Some are worried that the incident with Brad has created a public perception of Phoenix Trust as a bank that isn't in control. They're asking if we've gone too far too quickly." Sophie felt a surge of frustration rise within her. It was exactly what she had feared. The investors cared more about public perception than about doing the right thing. She knew she had to choose her words carefully. "I understand the concerns," Sophie said, her voice calm but firm. "But let me make this clear. The incident with Brad wasn't about perception, it was about principle. Phoenix Trust has always stood for fairness, accessibility, and respect. We can't ignore those values just because it's uncomfortable or inconvenient." A few of the board members exchanged uneasy glances, and Sophie could feel the pressure mounting. "I've made it clear that this is not just a one-off situation. This is an ongoing commitment to change. If our investors can't see the value in that, then perhaps we need to reconsider who we're working with." The room fell silent. Sophie had made her point. She wasn't going to compromise on her principles. Not for the sake of short-term profits, not for the sake of appeasing critics. This was about building a legacy, a company that stood for something far greater than just making money. Richard cleared his throat. "I think you've made your position clear, Sophie. We'll take these concerns into consideration. But we're with you. We trust your judgment." Sophie nodded, her expression resolute. "Thank you. But make no mistake, this is just the beginning. Phoenix Trust will be the bank that leads by example. And if some people can't handle that, they can leave." As she walked out of the meeting, Sophie felt a sense of quiet triumph. She had just stood her ground in the face of the board's concerns, and she knew that no matter what came next, she was going to continue pushing for the changes Phoenix Trust needed to make. Back at the bank, as the D&I training sessions continued and the new policies began to take hold, Sophie couldn't help but feel the weight of what she had started. She had made it clear that this was about more than just correcting one incident. It was about redefining the culture of Phoenix Trust and making it a place where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, felt valued. But Sophie knew that true change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, and it would require continued vigilance and commitment from everyone involved. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the cusp of something monumental, something that would set a new standard for corporate responsibility. As she sat at her desk reviewing the latest figures on the success of the training programs, her phone buzzed with a new message from Grace. "Our partners are already noticing the change. More clients are choosing Phoenix Trust because of our commitment to diversity. This is only the beginning." Sophie smiled to herself, feeling a sense of pride. This fight was far from over, but she was already seeing the ripple effect. Phoenix Trust was no longer just a bank, it was a movement, one that had the power to change not just the company, but the entire industry. And for Sophie Bell, that was just the beginning. Months passed since the pivotal day when Sophie Bell had taken a stand at Phoenix Trust Bank. The ripple effect of that moment had stretched far beyond the walls of the bank, reaching into every facet of the financial industry and setting a new standard for corporate accountability. Phoenix Trust, under Sophie's leadership, had become a beacon of progress, an institution that truly believed in its values of fairness, respect, and accessibility for all. As the months wore on, Sophie watched the transformation unfold. The diversity and inclusion initiatives had not only been embraced by employees, but they had also been championed by clients who sought out a bank that reflected their own values. Clients from every walk of life, business owners, community leaders, and everyday individuals were flocking to Phoenix Trust, drawn by its commitment to genuine change. Sophie had always known that changing an institution's culture was no small feat, but seeing the results of the hard work and dedication of her team gave her a profound sense of pride. Phoenix Trust was no longer just a financial institution. It had become a symbol of transformation, a model for what a bank could be when it put people over profits. One afternoon, Sophie received a call that would prove to be one of the most important moments of her career. It was from the president of the National Financial Association, a powerful industry group that had long been known for its conservative stance on corporate practices. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, yet Sophie could sense the weight behind it. "Sophie, we've been watching your progress at Phoenix Trust, and we've heard the reports coming in from your clients and investors. We believe your work is setting a new benchmark for the industry. We'd like to offer you a position on the National Financial Association's advisory board." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. She had never expected such an offer, and yet, deep down, she knew this was a crucial step toward expanding the reach of her message. Accepting the position would mean she could have a direct hand in shaping policies that impacted not just Phoenix Trust, but the entire financial industry. It was an opportunity to push for the changes she had fought for on a much broader scale. "I'm honored," Sophie replied, her voice steady with resolve. "I've always believed that change in our industry is long overdue. If this is the platform that allows me to do that, then I'm in." The offer marked a new chapter in Sophie's journey, a chance to lead on a national stage, influencing policy and business practices to make the financial world more equitable and inclusive. But Sophie knew that the work didn't stop there. It was only the beginning of what could become a global movement. With the announcement of her new role, the media attention around Sophie intensified. News outlets lauded her for her leadership and vision, and her story became a symbol of how one person could challenge the status quo and spark real change. Sophie was invited to speak at industry conferences, participate in panels, and contribute to thought leadership pieces. As she traveled around the country, meeting with business leaders, activists, and everyday citizens, she felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Yet, despite all the accolades and recognition, Sophie never lost sight of the ultimate goal. She had never set out to become a media sensation or a political figure. She had simply wanted to make a difference, one customer, one employee, one company at a time. And as she walked into her office one morning, glancing out over the city skyline, Sophie realized that the change she had worked so tirelessly for was finally beginning to take root. But there were still challenges ahead. As Phoenix Trust expanded its influence, competitors began to take notice. Some saw Sophie's success as a threat to the old guard, and whispers of resistance started to grow. Some felt the changes she had implemented were too radical, too risky. But Sophie knew better than anyone that true progress was never achieved by staying within the comfort zone. Change had to be bold. It had to be unapologetic. One evening, as Sophie sat at home reviewing the latest reports on Phoenix Trust's expansion, she received a text from Grace. "We've just received a letter from Brad Thomas. It seems he's decided to speak out about the changes at Phoenix Trust." Sophie raised an eyebrow, wondering what kind of response Brad might have after everything that had happened. She had expected some backlash from him, but not a public statement. She opened the message, and the text inside was straightforward. "I see now that my actions were wrong. I misunderstood the values that Phoenix Trust stood for. I'm sorry for the way I treated you, Sophie. I hope you continue to lead the way for others." Sophie stared at the message, taken aback. It was a humbling moment. Brad had been one of the first to challenge her vision, and now he was acknowledging that he had been part of the problem. Sophie felt a sense of closure. He had been the face of the resistance, but now he was willing to acknowledge the importance of the changes she had fought for. It wasn't just her success, it was the success of every person who had stood up against the outdated systems of power and privilege. For the first time since the incident with Brad, Sophie allowed herself to reflect on how far she had come. The victory wasn't just about Phoenix Trust. It wasn't even just about the industry. It was about the people, every employee, every customer, every partner who had bought into the idea that fairness, inclusion, and respect weren't just ideals, but actionable goals. Sophie had turned an injustice into an opportunity for transformation, not just for herself, but for the world around her. Months later, as Sophie prepared for her first speech at the National Financial Association's annual conference, she stood in front of a full-length mirror, adjusting the hem of her blazer. The weight of the responsibility she now carried settled over her, but it was no longer a burden. It was a privilege. She had risen above the challenges, and now she had the chance to help shape the future. As she walked on stage to a standing ovation, Sophie felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She wasn't just speaking for Phoenix Trust anymore. She was speaking for the future of finance, for the future of business, and for the future of a world where fairness, justice, and equality were the standard, not the exception. The road to change was long, and it would never be easy. But Sophie Bell was no longer just an individual. She had become the symbol of a new era in business, a leader whose legacy would resonate long after the final applause faded. And for Sophie, that was the real victory.